Over the lifelong span of the Pokemon trading card game, there has always been really, really strong Pokemon cards that have changed the way the game is played and was very good in each format they were presented in. In today's video, I'm going to be ranking all of the best Pokemon cards of all time, and I'm going to be ranking them on how good they were for the game, whether they were bad for the game or whether they were perfectly fine for the game. I think it's a cool history lesson to kind of look back at all of these old Pokemon cards and see which one of them truly were bad for the game. Some of these cards also may have impacted future card designs and may have just completely altered how Pokemon have to print actual cards going forward, keeping some of these cards in mind. I think this is going to be a really cool video, and if y'all are excited for it, make sure to leave a like on the video, and if you're new here to the second channel, make sure to subscribe down below. Let me know what you think of this tier list, and what is your least favorite best card of all time? Very interested to hear down in the comments below, and without further ado, let's get into the ranking. All right, so here is the tier list I have compiled. Every single card here is, in my opinion, considered to be one of the strongest cards of all time, especially from their respective eras. Now, I don't have every single strongest card of all time on here, especially in a lot of the older sets. I am not very knowledgeable with a lot of the older stuff from like the mid 2000s, but everything kind of from Diamond and Pearl up, I have an idea of how good they were in the formats they are presented in. And if some of you guys don't know what some of these cards do, I, of course, will have Pokemon cards pulled up here so we can look up what some of the cards do, of course, and we can give them a read. And I can further explain my opinions on where each card stands. As you can see, I do have different tiers here. We got the making the game worse tier. Obviously, this tier is basically if the card was so good that it genuinely just made the game a worse environment. There's toxic, but not too game-breaking, where these cards were very, very good, and they may have been a little too toxic, but they weren't completely ruining the format altogether, but they were just not nice to have in the game regardless. And then there's Gatekeeper, but not too toxic. Some of these cards could have gatekept other cards from being good within the format, but they weren't over-the-top toxic like this card needs to go. And then there's Cool, obviously. You know, the card was fine. It was perfectly fine. It wasn't good for the game, but it wasn't bad for the game per se. And then finally, the card just flat out was good for the game. I think the card was healthy card design and genuinely made the game a lot more enjoyable when this card was around in the format. So, starting things off, we have one of the most notoriously infamous cards of all time, ADP. Yes, ADP, the godfather of bad card design. This card immediately is going to be shooting up into the making the game worse tier. ADP, for the time it was legal, which honestly was 2020 to what, 2022 is when it rotated, 2021, something like that. This card actually made the game a whole lot worse. It effectively warped the entire format around it to the point where single prize decks became obsolete. Now, if you don't know what ADP does, this card is without a doubt one of the most broken cards of all time, and it has arguably the best attack ever made in a card. So it does have the attack Altered Creation. For the rest of the game, your Pokemon's attacks do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon, and if this Pokemon has at least one extra water energy attached to it, you also get to take an extra prize card when you knock something out, which is just ridiculous. Now, it does require a metal and a water energy. Now, back in the era where ADP was legal, finding a metal and a water energy was actually pretty easy. One of the ways people would pull this off was, of course, with Energy Switch Metal Saucer. Zacian V was a notorious partner for ADP because Zacian hit insanely high numbers. It had a good synergy with Metal Saucer, which you would want to use in order to build up your own ADP, and it just caused ADP to be a game-warping card. You could quite literally do ADP's GX attack on your first turn, which was ridiculous. Basically, that meant the entire game you had it in effect. Now, obviously, there is a debate. Well, okay, wasn't there a way to stop ADP? Like, there had to have been some card in the format that prevented ADP's effect from working. There was not. There is one card in the game, Pokemon Ranger, which does prevent ADP's effect from working after you use it. The problem is Pokemon Ranger did not exist in the standard format when ADP was around. This basically just caused ADP to run amok, and it ruled the format. It was actually pretty okay before Zacian V came out. It saw a little bit of play, but then Zacian V came out, and the card completely changed the entire landscape of the TCG. The format got really quick, too, when cards like Dedenne and Crobat both existed in the same format. You were able to really pull off these crazy Zacian V combos a lot quicker with ADP, and overall ADP was just a bad card. I was really happy when it finally rotated because genuinely the card did ruin the format. I would make the case that this is actually the worst design card of all time. I think it is easily one of the worst cards Pokemon have ever printed, and it basically just left a bad taste in everyone's mouth with the idea of tag team GXs. Yeah, ADP definitely, in my opinion, is like the ultimate bad card. It by far ruined the game. It caused cards like Crushing Hammer to become like a 4 of in every deck, because Crushing Hammer was one of actually the best cards that would stop ADP. But yeah, ADP, without a doubt, is one of the worst cards ever designed, and basically just ruined the format. Next up, we have Palkia V-Star. Ironically, we got Palkia and Arceus. There's no Dialga on this list, unfortunately. There's a couple Dialga cards I considered, but there wasn't really any Dialga card I could consider the best of all time. But we do have Palkia V-Star here. Palkia V-Star, I definitely think, is more in the gatekeeper, but not too toxic section. Palkia V-Star, for the time that it was the best deck in the format, definitely caused the meta to warp around it. With its Subspace Fall attack, it did cause a lot of things to be a little bit faster. I mean, a lot of decks had to keep up with Palkia V-Star, and basically it was really good when it was combined with Greninja, Shady Dealings, Inteleon, which I both included within this list, actually, which is pretty funny. But yeah, Palkia is just a very powerful card, and when it was best deck in the format, it did kind of warp the format around itself. Its attack does 60 plus 20 damage for each bench Pokemon. So basically it punished you for benching Pokemon. And benching Pokemon is a lot of the time how you're able to play the game, how your deck is able to function. And Palkia was one of the most annoying top decks in the format, because not only did it mattered who went first with this card, but it also just mattered in the fact that you got punished for overbenching, or even just putting 1 or 2 Pokemon on your bench. A lot of the time was really bad for you. Like, Palkia would just flat out win games if they took the first knockout. And not only that, but it also caused a lot of power with, like, Greninja. Like, being able to use turn 2 Greninja was ridiculous. If you weren't able to get Manaphy in play in time, you would just sometimes lose instantly from a Greninja. Having Shady Deals and Inteleon meant that the Palkia was always able to chain together these really powerful attacks. There were cards in the format that countered Palkia. There was a lot of good lighting Pokemon, like Flying Pikachu VMAX. There was Regieleki in the Regi deck. But these were always just ways to stop Palkia, but they weren't surefire ways to beat Palkia. Palkia didn't really have a good counter. Palkia kind of got power crept out of the format when Silver Tempest came out, which, of course, we're going to get to a little bit later in this video. But Palkia, I would put in the gatekeep, but not too toxic. I think Palkia was definitely a problematic deck when it did exist and was the best deck in the format. But I think that it wasn't that bad. It wasn't as bad as something like ADP. It was just an annoying top deck that it felt like the games got decided by who won the coin flip or who took the first knockout with Palkia. Like, if you got the first 2 prize kill with your Palkia V, if you knocked out their opposing V Pokemon, a lot of the time you would just win the game on the spot. And the fact that it had an engine like Greninja and Inteleon felt really bad because they just were able to find almost anything every single turn. But I wouldn't really consider Palkia to be like as bad as it could have been. Next up is Arceus. Now, Arceus V-Star, in my opinion, was good for the game. I was really liking Arceus V-Star when it existed within the format. Now, Arceus definitely is one of the strongest cards ever. You could argue that it is the best V-Star Pokemon of all time, because Arceus is such a creative card. I'm just a huge fan of Arceus. It does have that V-Star power, Starbirth, where once you're in turn, you can search deck for any 2 cards and put them in your hand. I mean, being able to do that is insane. Arceus is a card that is designed around going first. Like, whenever you're playing Arceus, you always want to go first. You always want to get a turn 1 Arceus V down with an energy attachment, and then on your second turn, you want to have that Arceus V-Star to then do Trinity Nova, which does 200 damage, and then you can search your deck for 3 basic energies and attach them to your Pokemon V in any way that you like. So there's a ton of Pokemon V you could play Arceus with. Obviously, one of the strongest contenders with Arceus was Flying Pikachu VMAX, because it was one of the best attackers against the Palkia deck at the time. But even before Palkia, Arceus ruled the format. The first ever regional we ever had since the pandemic, Arceus V-Star Gengar VMAX won that tournament. Arceus V-Star, in my opinion, is a good card. I think there are people that might argue the card was bad for the game. And much like Palkia, it's another card that really incentivizes going first. Or it's one of those cards where it's like if you went first in a matchup, it really gave you a huge advantage against other decks, which feels bad. But I don't think Arceus is as bad as Palkia. It's a very well-designed card, and it honestly caused a lot of really wacky VMAX cards to all of a sudden become top-tier cards. Like Flying Pikachu VMAX, looking back, is one of the strongest VMAXs we ever had because it was one of the best partners Arceus had. Cards like Duraludon and Umbreon VMAX, 2 other VMAX cards that I think in other scenarios wouldn't have been that good, saw a lot of play because they were super powerful with Arceus V-Star. Arceus is still in the format, and to this day is still seen play within tournaments. It's being played with Giratina V-Star. It's seen some play with just Judge Spam in general. Like, it's just a really cool card, and I'm always happy to see Arceus do well. It's one of my favorite cards of all time, and I'm going to call it good for the game. It's just cool to have a deck like this in the format. It's not, like, broken to the point where you can't counter it. It's just a very strong card that, in my opinion, created some healthy decks. Next up is Garchomp C Level X. If you don't know what this card does, it was a very powerful Level X card. There's a couple Level X's I did put within this tier list, and I think that Garchomp is easily one of the best Level X's we have ever seen. I'm going to put it in the cool category. Did kind of change the way decks had to be built because it did have a very strong attack, Dragon Rush. Discard 2 energy attached to your Garchomp C, choose one of your opponent's Pokemon. This attack does 80 damage to that Pokemon, then you can't use Dragon Rush during your next turn. And then it had the Poke Power, not ability, Poke Power. Once you're in turn, when you play Garchomp C Level X from your hand to evolve your active Garchomp C, you can remove all damage counters from each of your Pokemon, which was kind of crazy. Each of your Pokemon SP, which was nuts. Garchomp definitely was a very strong card. Garchomp C Level X saw a lot of play alongside another very infamous Level X card, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Garchomp was fine. It did have a very good snipe attack. And it did promote a lot of aggressive play, mainly when you did pair it with, of course, the other Level X card we're going to talk about. But I think Garchomp was cool. I don't think it was, like, good for the game, per se. Like, the format definitely could have maybe been a little bit better if Garchomp didn't exist, but I don't think the card was bad for the game at all. It was cool. It was a fine card. I liked it, and it definitely created a little bit more of a hostile environment just because of the snipe attack being so good when you had tool cards like Energy Gain, which allowed you to do the attack for a double colorless energy. That was really strong. Double colorless energy did get reprinted in the Heart Gold Soul Silver base set, which did enable Garchomp to be a whole lot stronger, and it made its snipe attack even better. And it turned the Luxchomp deck into tier 1. But Garchomp saw play with a lot of other different cards in general. Sometimes it was just played in any deck just because being able to snipe your opponent was really, really good. Next up, we have Claydol, arguably the best draw engine in the Pokemon TCG. Claydol was a really cool card. It's very similar to what Bibarel does nowadays. So Claydol, we're going to look up here real quick. Claydol does have a very unique Poke Power here, the Cosmic Power. Once you're in your turn, you may choose up to 2 cards from your hand and then put them at the bottom of your deck. If you do, draw cards until you have 6 in your hand. So basically, if you have 2 cards in your hand that are clogging up your hand, you can put them to the bottom of the deck and then you get to draw some new fresh cards, which is really nice. It was a very healthy draw engine for the game. It's kind of like if Bibarel had this ability, it'd be pretty broken. There's a reason why Bibarel Skwovet sees a lot of plays, because it's kind of similar to what Claydol used to do. Claydol, I'm going to say it's good for the game. One of the strongest draw cards we've ever seen in the history of the TCG, and it was good for the game. It's always healthy to have good draw engine cards like this in the format. Cards like Bibarel, cards like Octillery, they're always good to have around because they're just healthy draw mechanics. They let you play the game. They don't draw an absurd amount of cards like other draw engines do, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but they're healthy enough where they aren't overbearing and they don't cause decks to go through half their deck in like one turn. It's just a nice little draw card that lets you recycle cards. If you have dead cards in your hand, you can put them at the bottom of your deck, draw some more cards, and it just kind of keeps your deck flowing, but not in a way where, like I said, it makes your deck overbearing and like super fast. Next up is another draw support Pokemon, Cleffa. Now, I did want to include this. This is a card I am a little familiar with. Cleffa is a very interesting card here that was one of the best draw support Pokemon we've had in the format. Now, if you all know, the Grasping Draw Cleffa in the format right now sees quite a bit of play because it's a very good draw card in the early game. It lets you set up, and that's what this baby Cleffa did. It has that attack, Eek, shuffle your hand in your deck, and then draw 7 cards. Back in the day when this card was legal, the format was a lot slower, so a card like Cleffa was able to use its Eek attack a lot more often, and it basically allowed each player to kind of set their board up because you could just sit there with your Cleffa, use Eek over and over again. But here's where this card got a little bit better. Because it was classified as a baby Pokemon, basically it states, if this baby Pokemon is your active Pokemon and your opponent tries to attack, your opponent flips a coin, and before doing any damage, and then if tails, your opponent's turn ends without the attack. So essentially, if they try to attack the Cleffa and they flip the coin and the coin flip lands on tails, well, they don't get to attack your Cleffa and your Cleffa stays alive. And back in the day when the format was a little bit slower, this was a really good baby rule power thing to have because it allowed you to just kind of set up your board a little bit and just keep drawing over and over. And like I said, when the format was a little bit slower, when Cleffa existed, this was fine. The baby rule definitely maybe was a little bit cheesy. Like, I'm sure back in the day, a lot of people got frustrated because they could not hit the Cleffa at all because of the stupid coin flip effect. But overall, I think Cleffa was fine for the game. I think it was a good card. cards like this that let you set up and play the game, I think are healthy for the game, and Cleffa definitely, in my opinion, deserves to be in the good for the game category. Next up is Darkrai EX. Now, Darkrai EX was one of the first big basic Pokemon we had seen in the format that really shifted the game. And there was another big one on this list, but Darkrai was definitely up there too. It saw so much play in 2012, it was ridiculous. Darkrai definitely is one of the strongest EXs of all time, and it came out at a really good time just because of another certain EX card. Now, it does have that ability, Dark Cloak. Each of your Pokemon with a dark energy on them have no retreat cost, which was a nice ability to have. But back in the day, its attack, Night Spear, was really, really powerful. Doing 90 damage and then 30 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon was pretty good back in the day. Dark Patch also came out when Darkrai EX came out, so it had some kind of energy acceleration. The big thing with Darkrai, though, was that resistance to Psychic, which back in the day was very good because Darkrai saw a ton of play alongside Mewtwo EX. Darkrai actually came out at a decent time in the game, where Mewtwo was running the format. Every deck had to play Mewtwo, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but Darkrai did come out to help balance Mewtwo out a little bit, kind of keep it in check. Then Darkrai immediately just started to rule the metagame. The format just kind of became Darkrai Wars at that point. Honestly, you could argue this card was kind of in between Cool and Gatekeeper, just because it did help push another broken EX from seeing mass amount of play. Even though Mewtwo still saw a mass amount of play when Darkrai came out, it just wasn't completely just nothing but Mewtwo. I would probably put Darkrai maybe in between Cool and Gatekeeper. It wasn't really that problematic of a card. It was a very fast card because it did have a lot of really good cards that did support it. Like I said, Dark Patch was really good. Cards like Hypnotoxic Laser were also very useful in combination with the Darkrai EX. But I don't think Darkrai like ruined the game or anything. It could have been a bit of a Gatekeeper because it was still like a very fast, hard-hitting EX card like Mewtwo was. But I wouldn't say that it was like, actually, you know what? Maybe we could put it like the same Palkia category. I don't know. Yeah, I like how when the card came out, it did help balance Mewtwo, but then Darkrai immediately took over the format, and maybe that is case enough to maybe just classify it as like more of a Gatekeeper type card. Next up is Dedenne GX, another very strong draw support card. But unlike Claydol and Cleffa, this wasn't mainly just, you know, good for the game per se. It would actually argue that it made broken combos a lot more easier to pull off. And to this day, in, you know, expanded format, you could still play Dedenne in your deck and have these wacky combos be pulled off super quickly because Dedenne has a very good ability here. Now, Dedenne GX does have that ability, Dede Change. When you place Pokemon from your hand on your bench, you can discard your hand and draw 6 cards. You can only use one Dede Change ability each turn. But effectively, it just gave you 6 new cards. It's basically like having an extra research where, I mean, instead of 7, you're drawing 6, but still being able to discard your hand and draw 6 cards was nuts. When you combine this with Crobat V, which when you played it down, you can draw cards until you have 6 in your hand. You can only do the abilities once per turn, but still, it was just a very strong card. And when you're looking to find a certain card, it's a very good card to have because you can dig through your deck a little bit deeper. And if you're trying to pull off combos, it's even better. Dedenne in combination with like the ADP was extremely powerful because if you were looking for that energy switch combo, you could easily use Dedenne to dig for that energy switch to pull off that turn 1 Altered Creation GX. I would argue that Dedenne was maybe in the toxic category. Like, I just think it was just kind of unnecessary to have a card like this in the format. Crobat V did come out. Crobat V was, I think, a lot more balanced because it didn't immediately discard your hand, which a lot of the time was actually good because not only did you get to refresh your hand, but sometimes you actually get to discard important pieces that you need to have in your discard pile for other combos. I would argue that NA was bad for the game because it's just, these type of cards just allow other decks to be a little too fast. Like, cards like Crobat V and Squawkabilly are a lot more healthier for the game because they just aren't as powerful as Dedenne. Like, being able to potentially use Dedenne and research in the same turn is kind of silly. I mean, you're drawing like 13 cards. That's a lot of deck digging, and back then, it just allowed a lot more decks to be even more aggressive. But I wouldn't say that Dedenne made the game worse or anything. One of the big problems with playing Dedenne was that it always was a liability to have in play. When Boss's Order got reprinted, Dedenne immediately had a bit of a target on its head because all of a sudden cards like Boss's Order for a game on Dedenne became super common. So, while Dedenne definitely had an annoying ability that I think was slightly toxic for sure, I don't think that it was game ruining. Even though it did make cards like ADP a lot more stronger because of its ability, let you, draw more cards to your deck. I don't think it made the game worse, but it just kind of was a dumb ability to have in the format that I thought was a little toxic because you just got to see so many cards. And when you had other strong draw cards in the format, like the Crobat V to do even more deck digging, you saw a lot of cards in a single turn, which just felt pretty good. Next up, we have Ditto Prism Star. I'm a big fan of this card, and I definitely wanted to highlight the Ditto Prism Star here. Now, if you don't know what Ditto Prism Star does, it has that Almighty Evolution ability. Once you're in turn, you may put any Stage 1 Pokemon from your hand onto this Pokemon to evolve it, which is really cool. So it basically acted as a fifth basic for a specific Stage 1. One of the cool things Ditto opened up was it actually allowed a lot of wacky Stage 1s to see play because you could play Ditto in your deck alongside the Stage 1. A good example of this was Alolan Muck, which shut off basic abilities when it was in play. Instead of playing the Grimer, you could just play a Ditto in your deck, and if you had other Stage 1s like Zoroark GX or whatever in your deck, you could choose to either turn your Ditto into a Muck or maybe even a Zoroark. It was just a very well-designed card. I think a lot of people would argue that it's one of the greatest designed cards of all time, and I would agree with that. I would actually put Ditto in the good for the game category. I think Ditto was a really cool ability to have in the format, and it was good card design. I would love to see a card like Ditto get reprinted within the future. Next up is Tapu Lele GX, arguably the most infamous big basic search Pokemon ability draw card we've ever had. Tapu Lele was a format staple for the entirety of its existence. One of the things that made Lele so good was its ability was so good back in the day when the supporter rule change was a bit different. Back in the day, you used to play a supporter on your first turn, and when you had Lele's ability, it was really good. It's got that Wonder Tag ability here, where when you play it from your hand onto your bench, you can search deck for your supporter, reveal it, and put it into your hand. This is very similar to Lumineon V, which does exist in our format. Lumineon's a pretty good card that sees a lot of play, but back in the day, Lele saw a lot of play, not only because the power creep was less big, where Lumineon nowadays is, a big liability to have on your bench, where back in the day, having Lele on your bench to find a supporter wasn't really that bad, because not every deck was able to do 170 damage that easily. And when the supporter rule changed a lot different, you could play Lele on your first turn. Lele for Bridget became a big deal. Bridget was a supporter that allowed you to put 3 basic Pokemon onto your bench. And it was very good. It allowed you to set up very easily. A lot of setup decks wanted to play this. Any deck that just played a lot of basics that wanted to evolve into GXs or whatever really enjoyed Bridget, and Lele for Bridget became an iconic duo. One of the main things that also made Lele so good, it actually was a good attacker. It has the attack Energy Drive, which for 2 colorless energy did 20 damage times the amount of energy on both active Pokemon. You just didn't hit for weakness, which was fine. I mean, back in the day, that ability was really, really good alongside its attack. Lele wasn't a liability either because, like I said, it actually was hard to do 170 damage back in the day. I definitely think Lele was good for the game. It allowed a lot of decks to function. I think a lot of decks did rely very heavily on the crutch of Lele being able to find cards like the Bridget, but I would still argue Lele was ultimately good for the game because a lot of decks probably would have a hard time functioning if they weren't able to immediately just grab like a setup supporter like Bridget. I would argue maybe Lele got a little bit worse when we had cards like Welder in the format, but did Lele and Welder even exist in the same format? I actually don't even remember, to be honest. Maybe they didn't. But overall, Tapu Lele GX is a very strong card. Not only was it a good ability, but it also ended up being a pretty relevant attacker because it did exist in the same format as double colorless energy. Next up is Execute. This ability is ridiculous. Execute by far has one of the most insane abilities we've ever seen. It's got the ability Propagation. Once you're in turn, before you attack, if this Pokemon is in your discard pile, you may put this card into your hand. Now, this ability you can use as many times as you like in a turn, meaning that if you have 2 Execute in your discard pile, you can put 2 of them in your hand for free. Now, you're probably like, well, how is that good? What use would you get out of putting Execute back in your hand? There's no good Exeggutor card, right? Well, that's because this card was super synergistic with other discard effects like Ultra Ball, one of the best ball search cards of all time, and cards like Junk Arm. There was also Superior Energy Retrieval. All these discarding cards synergize really well with Execute in all kinds of different formats. Execute has a very insane ability that I'm surprised never got eroded. I would probably just put it in the category of like, I don't know. It's weird because I don't think it's like toxic or anything. It did allow for some pretty ridiculous combos to exist in the format because being able to just put 2 eggs in your hand and then you can use Ultra Ball for free essentially is pretty absurd. Like it basically turns Execute into a grab any card out of your deck if you want type effect. It was really good in the format when it was around. I don't know where I would put it. It's not really a gatekeeper. Like it doesn't really gatekeep anything from seeing play. It's not really like an overly toxic ability. It's just a ridiculous ability that I'm surprised maybe never got banned. Maybe I could put in like the toxic category because it's just kind of it is kind of a ridiculous effect. But I don't know if I would really call it like bad for the game or anything like that. It's just a weird ability that I'm surprised never got a rod out or anything. Like execute to this day, you can still use as many times you like in a turn. Like you can discard it, you can put it right back in your hand, discard it again, and then just keep doing that over and over again until you don't need to anymore. It's kind of insane and kind of silly. And you can have multiple executes in discard pile on top of just the single execute. Next up are the Garbodors. Now, Garbodor has had two very infamously strong cards. First off, we got the Garbotoxin Garbodor here. Now, Garbodor Garbotoxin has one of the strongest abilities of all time. That ability states if you have a tool card on it, each ability or each Pokemon in play that has an ability in each player's hand, discard pile, have no abilities. So essentially, you shut off all abilities. So imagine nowadays you have a Garbodor in play with a tool on it. Your opponent can't use stuff like Quick Search or Bibarel or anything like that. It's a very strong card. It's not just specifically rule box Pokemon. It's any ability. And back in the day when this card was around, there were very ability-heavy reliant decks. Garbodor basically got reprinted twice. This ability existed back in the Black and White era. So this Garbotoxin card was essentially made twice in two different formats. And both formats, it was one of the strongest cards in the game. I would think it's good for the game. I think this type of ability is good for the game. There's not really any bad side to it, as long as there's ways to slow down the Garbodor. One of the main things Garbodor is countered by is tool removal cards. Back in the day, cards like Tool Scrapper existed, Field Blower existed, so Garbodor did have ways to be countered. I'm sure if they reprinted Garbotoxin right now in our current Scarlet and Violet format, you could easily just play Lost Vacuum or I guess would Jamie Tower work, actually? I don't know if Jamie Tower would work, actually, but Lost Vacuum would be a good counter to Garbodor. I think it's good for the game. Having ability lock is fine in my opinion because it basically stops decks from working, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think Garbotoxin's a healthy card. And then we have Trashalanche Garbodor, the other really strong Garbodor card we saw. This card effectively changed the format when it came out. It's got that attack Trashalanche for 1 psychic energy, does 20 damage for each item card in your opponent's discard pile. You basically punish your opponent for playing a ton of item cards, but this card also forces your opponent to play very differently because if they know that you have Garbodor in your deck, they can't just overextend and just burn all their items because then Garbodor is going to do a ton of damage. And back in the day, there were a lot of good items like Nest Ball, Ultra Ball, Rare Candy, Max Elixir, just to name a few. Items were very big back in the day, and you had to be very cautious with how you played your items. Now, I used to kind of hate Garbodor back in the day when it existed because I'm like, bro, just let me play the game, bro. Like, I hated not being able to use as many items in a turn because I would just get punished by a Trashalanche. But looking back, it was good for the game. I think that it punished a lot of aggro decks. It did slow the format down a little bit, and it really did make people have to deck build a lot more differently because they would get punished if they played 2 item cards within their deck. So, yeah, Garbodor probably good for the game. Both Garbodors, in my opinion, were good for the game. Honestly, if Pokemon were to reprint either Garbodor right now in our current Scarlet and Violet format, I would be very happy to see that because I think Garbodor always was good for the game. Even though I used to hate Trashalanche back in the day, looking back, it was actually good for the game, and I take back my words. Next up is Gardevoir, arguably one of the strongest Gardevoir cards of all time, and believe me, there has been a lot of good Gardevoir cards. This card definitely is in the Hall of Fame of powerful cards. It has that Pokepower Telepass. Once you're in turn before you attack, you may search your opponent's discard pile for supporter card and use it as the effect of that card, which is kind of insane. You can't use more than 1 Telepass Pokepower each turn. So obviously you can't just spam the ability if you have like 3 Gardevoirs in play, but basically it allowed you to play 2 supporters in a single turn. And then you have the attack Psychic Lock that does 60 damage, and during your opponent's next turn, they can't use any Pokepowers on his or her Pokemon, which is honestly pretty strong because you're able to stop other decks from also functioning. Kind of like how Garbodor worked, you're locking your opponent from being able to play part of their deck because they can't play any Pokepowers, which Pokepowers were kind of what abilities were before they got changed into abilities. There are Pokepowers and bodies. Powers more used to be what abilities used to be back in the day. And yeah, this card was pretty good. I think it's a cool card. Gardevoir was a very strong card throughout its entire run. And honestly, there's not that many cards in the format that were super good throughout their entire existence within the TCG. And Telepass Gardevoir happened to be one of those. I think Gardevoir, Gallade, Gardevoir in general, it won like 2 World Championships. It dominated the entirety of the Pokemon TCG throughout its run. It definitely deserves to be one of the strongest cards of all time. I think it's cool. I don't think it was like gatekeepy. Like, yes, it had a very strong attack and a very absurd power where you can use multiple supporters in a turn with its power, but I don't think it was like super toxic or gatekeepy, though it definitely was BDIF for a long time and essentially stayed relevant for its entire lifespan in the game. Next up is Genesect. EX, the Team Plasma Genesect. I did want to highlight this. Genesect EX was one of the strongest cards in the game when it existed. It did win the 2014 World Championship. So I did want to highlight the Genesect EX here as one of the standout EXs from its era. It has that ability, Red Signal, when you attach a Plasma Energy from your hand to the Genesect, you may switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with his or her active. So you basically get a built-in Gust effect. And back then, I don't think there was a supporter Gust card. We didn't see Lysander until Flashfire. There was Pokemon Catcher, but I think by this time, Pokemon Catcher had gotten eroded where it was on a coin flip. So Gust was actually a little bit more harder to come by, I think, back in the day. I think. I can't remember exactly, but I know the Red Signal was very good to have because not every deck was able to Gust as easily. And then your attack, Megalo Cannon, did 100 damage, and then 20 to 1 your opponent's bench Pokemon. Fairly strong attack with a fairly good ability. You combine Genesect EX with other Plasma cards, like Colress Machine, which allowed you to put a Plasma Energy from your deck on your Genesect. You had Virizion EX, which allowed you to be immune to a powerful item back in the day, Hypnotoxic Laser, and you use Virizion EX to power up your own Genesect a little bit easier. And like I said, it did win the World Championships. I think it's cool. It is a very strong Poke Power, like our ability, being able to have that built-in Gust is pretty nuts, but I think Genesect was cool for the game and was fine. What Genesect was not so cool for the game, and I think everybody used to hate this deck, was the Mew VMAX deck, which in my opinion was really good just because of Genesect V. Like, Mew VMAX is a good card, but I think the reason why Mew VMAX was such a broken deck was because of the Genesect V's ability. And I mean, if for whatever reason, if y'all don't know what Genesect V does, this card is ridiculously broken. It is by far one of the strongest draw abilities we've ever seen on a card. Basically, once you're in turn, you may draw cards until you have as many cards in your hand as you have Fusion Strike Pokemon in play. So basically, if you put 6 Fusion Strike Pokemon in play, you can draw cards up until you have 6 cards in your hand. And you can do this ability over and over again. So if you have like 3 Genesect in play, you can keep putting your hand down low so you can keep drawing through a lot of cards. You got to see a lot of your deck in a single turn thanks to Genesect V. And of course, this attack, Technoblast, doing 210 damage, was really good with Mew VMAX, so you can copy it to do a ton of damage. You had Power Tablet, Ultra Ball, Quick Ball, all these cards that allowed you to discard your hand, Cramomatic. Genesect just enabled the Mew VMAX deck, so I think you should highlight Genesect over Mew VMAX, obviously. I think this definitely, I mean, probably toxic, but not game-ruining. There was a time where Mew VMAX was by far, in a way, the BDIF during its meta of the Fusion Strike before Brilliant Stars had released. It was by far the best deck, and I think it was bad for the game, but overall, Mew VMAX, it didn't get worse, but it did stay relevant. In fact, Mew VMAX, you could argue, like Gardevoir, as listed earlier, is one of the cards that stayed relevant throughout its entire life cycle. I definitely think Genesect was toxic. Maybe not game-ruining. There were counters to it. You could play Path of the Peak, obviously, which was a big one. And then, obviously, more powerful Dark Pokemon came out. Like, Arceus V-Star rivaled Mew VMAX in power. Of course, there's a reason why Gengar VMAX Arceus won the first major tournament back since the pandemic. Was because Gengar VMAX just destroyed the Mew VMAX deck. And, yeah, Genesect definitely was toxic. Maybe not super game-ruining. Like, if I'm talking Genesect and ADP, like, I don't think ADP and Genesect are on the same level as bad for the game. Like, they didn't completely ruin the game. You could argue if Mew VMAX stayed as good as it was during its Fusion Strike era, well, before Brilliant Stars, okay, maybe you could bump Genesect up into the making the game worse, but I think over time, it just kind of got balanced out. Cards like Spiritomb had to get printed, Drapion V got printed, like, all these counters got printed, though Mew still ended up being one of the best decks in the game. You know, it was fine. Like, I don't think it was super over the top broken, making the game worse, but definitely a pretty toxic card for sure, because it just no deck in the format had the ability to draw that many cards throughout a single turn like Genesect did. It was ridiculous. Yeah, just a crazy broken card for sure. Next up is Gengar Mimikyu GX. There are a lot of tag team Pokemon on this list because a lot of the tag team Pokemon, truthfully, are just overpowered cards. And Gengar Mimikyu only really saw play due to its Horror House GX attack. Your opponent can't play any cards from their hand during their next turn if this Pokemon has at least 1 extra Psychic Energy on it. Each player gets to draw cards until they have 7 in their hand. The main use of Gengar Mimikyu was just that first effect where you prevented your opponent from being able to do anything. You basically can win the game if you go Gengar GX and they can't do anything, and then the next turn you just knock out their active Pokemon because they can't play any cards. They can't bench any Pokemon, they can't play any supporters, they can't attach energy. They just couldn't do anything. They just had to pass, which made this card really stupid and kind of enabled some pretty ridiculous combos, and basically just not being able to play the game for a turn was toxic. probably would be in the toxic category. Thankfully, this card didn't like rule the format or anything. Like, it's not like Gengar Mimikyu Tag Team GX completely dominated the format and saw like an overbearing amount of play like ADP did, but definitely was a toxic card to have in the format. It's just not a very fun card because like you literally just lose the game on the spot. If they just go Gengar, you pass, then they win the game. It's just a pretty stupid attack that definitely, you know, maybe, I don't know, could get banned one day if Expanded ever returns. So I did want to highlight the Gengar card. Next up is Radiant Greninja, another fairly recent card for today's video. Radiant Greninja has obviously one of the strongest abilities we've ever seen. Being able to discard energy from your hand to draw 2 cards is really good. And honestly, a lot of decks do get a lot of value out of being able to put energy in the discard pile. However, then you have Greninja's attack, Moonlight Shuriken, where you can discard 2 energy from this Pokemon, and it does 90 damage to 2 of your opponent's Pokemon. So a lot of the time, Greninja can just win the game on the spot. If your opponent does not put a Manaphy down, Greninja just knocks 2 Pokemon out, and that's it. Sometimes you're playing a deck like Charizard, you put 2 Charmanders down, you don't have a Manaphy, you just pass, and then your opponent manages to Moonlight Shuriken you on their second turn, and that sometimes the game just ends on the spot because of that. So Greninja definitely is kind of in the middle of like good and bad. Like, I think its ability is good for the game. It's really good to have an ability like this around in the format, but the attack is where things get a little cheesy, and a lot of the times you just lose the game because your opponent turn 2 Greninjas you, whether it's through Mirage Gate, whether it's through Palkia V-Star. Like I said, back in the Palkia era, when Palkia was BDIF, they could abuse that turn 2 Greninja you and punish you for not putting a Manaphy on your bench. And even then, they can play Canceling Clone if they really want to bypass Manaphy. So, I mean, I would probably just put in the Gatekeeper category like Palkia. I think it's a good ability to have for the format, but it's the attack that's a little too cheesy. Like decks like Ancient Box, for example, can't really function without Greninja, you know what I mean? So it's like, Greninja definitely has a good ability, but the attack is a little too cheesy. I feel like they sort of cancel each other out. The like Lost Box is an infamous deck that can abuse Greninja, sometimes doing Greninja on their first turn, which is insane. So definitely a pretty strong card, but I don't know if I would put it in the toxic category. It definitely can be a little annoying when you just get randomly Greninja out of the game, or you just lose the game on the spot because your opponent immediately Greninja'd away your Pokemon. It's definitely not fun when that happens. Next up is the Shady Dealings Inteleon. I did want to highlight the Inteleon engine for how good it was back in the day. Like, every deck ran Shady Dealings. Like, there was also Drizzle, but obviously I kind of like Inteleon's more the highlight. When you play it from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, once during turn, you can search your deck for 2 trainers and put them in your hand. This card existed when Scoop Up Net existed, so you could reuse it over and over again. You had the Drizzle, which when you evolved it, you got 1 trainer out of your deck instead of 2. Inteleon basically ran the format. Palkia played it. A lot of Arc Piles played it. Most decks played Inteleon, and I think before Fusion Strike came out, every deck played Inteleon. Like, quite literally every deck played it. Urshifu, Jolteon, Leafeon. It was ridiculous. Inteleon definitely had a very strong ability, and one of the best support abilities we've ever seen. I would probably put it in the Gatekeeper category, kind of like Greninja, where it's like, it didn't really do anything wrong. Like, it's not like the card gatekept anything completely. It just was an ability that I think a lot of people got tired of because there wasn't really any other good draw ability that rivaled Greninja. There was Bibarel, which thankfully came out with Arceus V-Star, and that kind of helped a little bit. But definitely Greninja, or Inteleon, sorry, did kind of prevent any other draw engine from being accessible, and it got to the point where like every deck played the Inteleon engine. It effectively got you any card out of your deck, because getting any trainer, I mean, there were so many cards that allowed you to do anything. Like, you want a Pokemon, Inteleon for a Quick Ball. You want a supporter, get a supporter. If you want an energy card, grab an energy search. You know what I mean? So it just basically allowed you to get any card out of your deck, and it's kind of ridiculous. It could be reused to a Scoop Up Net, which was silly, and it created some pretty broken combos with Arceus and Charon's Care and Palkia V-Star. It definitely felt like it was kind of over the top, but not super toxic. Like, it's not too toxic, but it definitely felt a little insane that like every deck played Inteleon, and it kind of got to the point where it's like, okay, come on, bro, give us better support Pokemon abilities that could rival Inteleon. So yeah. Next up is Sableye, a very infamous card that definitely is a Gatekeeper. Now, of course, we all should know what Sableye does, but of course, when you have 10 or more cards in the Lost Zone, you can use the attack Lost Mine, put 12 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon in any way you like. This is a very strong attack. Now, Sableye did exist in a time where there was no way to actually counter Lost Mine that easily. Sableye, much like ADP, gate-kept single-prize decks from seeing play, and that was silly. Now, thankfully, Jirachi has come out. Jirachi has really saved the format, because I think if Sableye still existed and Jirachi didn't exist, Sableye would be a little bit too silly. a lot of decks right now don't even play Jirachi because they don't respect Lost Box, and then you play against the Sableye, and then you're like, oh, why didn't I play Jirachi? I should. So definitely still a very strong card. There's very good ways of getting to 10 in the Lost Zone very quickly. Like sometimes even on your second turn, you can get to 10 Lost Zone. And if your opponent doesn't get Jirachi down or don't play it, you can really start to run havoc and just cripple their setup, especially those evolving decks like Charizard and Gardevoir. 100%, I think Sableye. Honestly, I think you can make the case for making the game worse. I do think it's gotten a lot better now that we got Jirachi, but back in the day before Jirachi existed, which for the record was an entire year until we actually ended up getting Jirachi of Sableye being in the format, I do think that it made the game worse because it prevented a lot of single price decks from ever being relevant. There were like stuff like Regis that existed because they had 130 HP, but any like evolving basic deck couldn't see any play at all, or at least couldn't see the success they wanted to see because Sableye was such a powerful card and a popular card within the format. And when there's no way to block Sableye that easily, it just became a little too toxic, and I definitely think made the game worse because who knows what single price decks could have existed during the time Sableye was around before Jirachi. So I definitely think it made the game worse for sure, and it only has gotten better thanks to Jirachi. Then, of course, speaking of broken cards, we got Lugia V-Star, baby. Good old Lugia V-Star. Now, Lugia V-Star was the most dominant deck, arguably one of the most dominant decks we had ever seen in the history of the TCG during that Silver Tempest meta before rotation with Scarlet and Violet coming out. Obviously, its ability Summoning Star, letting you put 2 colorless Pokemon into play without a rule box is insane. You just put double Archeops in play, and then you just flood the board with special energy. And Lugia has still been a powerful deck since it did lose all those cards during that Scarlet and Violet, before Scarlet and Violet format, right? You saw Stoutland, Yveltal, Amazing Rare, and then it evolved into Single Strike Lugia, and then Colorless Lugia, and now Cinccino Lugia, and now you have Legacy Energy Lugia. Like, the Lugia train just doesn't stop. And Lugia, in my opinion, will still continue to be one of the strongest cards until it rotates. And the crazy thing with Lugia is it actually forces Pokemon to have to be careful with what special energy cards they print. They can no longer print a card like Aurora Energy or Rainbow Energy, which otherwise aren't terrible cards to have in the format. It's just because Archeops and Lugia exist, you can't play those or make them because then all of a sudden Lugia gets to abuse them, and then Lugia becomes an S-tier deck again, to the point where it ran the format for an entire life cycle of the card existing. I'm definitely going to put in the making worse category. Like, it was just a silly deck. Like, we had the Lost Origin format, which did have Sableye, which was a problem, but then Lugia came out, and immediately Lugia just took over the format and just became the best deck in the format for like 4 months until rotation, and then Lugia still continued to be one of the best decks in the format. So it's just crazy how strong this card is. I would argue that Lugia was more balanced after rotation. Like, I would say, like, right now, Lugia is a little bit more balanced than it ever was. Maybe you could argue that Legacy Energy makes the deck a little bit toxic again, but I definitely think, like, during Lugia's prime, dude, this card definitely made the game worse. It just, a lot of people hated that format for a reason. It just wasn't fun for the Lugia meta. Next up is Luxray Level X. We're going to quickly look at Luxray Level X here. Luxray Level X, like Garchomp, is one of the best Level X's, actually probably the best Level X of all time. Bright Look, once you're in turn, when you put Luxray GL Level X from your hand to evolve your active Luxray GL, you can switch the defending Pokemon with one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So yeah, back in the day when Gust on a supporter wasn't very common, or Gust wasn't that common in general, Luxray was the best gusting card you had. And then, of course, you had Flash Impact, which you could play Energy Gain with. You could do 60 damage for 1 energy, and you had to do 30 damage to one of your Pokemon. Luxchomp was a very strong deck. You were either gusting something up a Luxray, knocking it out, or you were sniping it with Garchomp. And Luxray saw so much play in all kinds of different decks, not just with Garchomp Level X. A lot of decks played Luxray. Because it just was a really good card. Its ability, a Pokebauer, was just so broken. Honestly, though, it was cool. I don't think the card was bad for the game at all. Much like Garchomp, it was cool. I think looking back, Luxray never was bad for the game. Like, you could argue it was gatekeeping, but not really, though. Like, back in the day, you gotta remember, when Luxray existed, the format was a little bit slower and not as, like, hyper-aggressive, fast-paced it is now. Maybe nowadays, if this was the only Gust ability, it would be a little too toxic, but back then it wasn't that bad at all. I think Luxray was cool. Maybe not good for the game, because Luxchomp was, like, by far and away the best deck in the format, but definitely a cool card for sure. All right, next up we have Magnezone Prime. I wanted to at least highlight one Prime card in today's video, and I was thinking of what Prime to choose. I was like, Donphan, maybe Yanmega. Are those Prime cards ever viable? But I think the best Prime card, or the one that I really wanted to highlight, was Magnezone Prime, which saw quite a bit of success during its run. It's got that Pokepower Magnetic Draw. Once you're in turn, you may draw cards until you have 6 in your hand. Of course, you could do this Poke Power multiple times. If you have multiple Magnezones in play, you can do this power. It lets you draw one more card than a Bibarel lets you draw right now, and it was really good back in the day as a stage 2, and it's a really good attacker with Lost Burn that does 50 damage. You can put as many energy attached to your Pokemon as you like in Lost Zone, doing 50 damage times number of energy, putting the Lost Zone in this way. So it's a pretty healthy card for the format, in my opinion. Good ability, pretty strong attack. It's nice when the support Pokemon can also be an attacker, you know, kind of like Tapu Lele, and another card we're going to get to very soon. I think Magnezone was good for the game. It's a really strong card, really good card, and I don't think it was bad for the game whatsoever. Next up, we have Marshadow. Now, this card did get banned. There are a few banned cards in this list, but we're talking about when they were legal within the format. I did not spell that right. Marshadow. Where's it at? Yeah, Let Loose Marshadow. So this card is now banned. It has that ability, Let Loose. When it played from hand onto your bench, you may have each player shuffle their hand to their deck and draw 4 cards. Essentially, what this basically forced is that you played it down and you put your opponent to 4 cards in their hand before they even had a turn. That's it. That's all it did. And it was pretty annoying when that did happen, because imagine not even getting a turn yet, and when you start your turn, you now just have 4 cards in your hand. It was a little broken. It did end up getting banned because the ability was kind of toxic. Definitely making the game worse for sure. Like, when this card was around, it definitely did make the game worse. It just wasn't fun having a 4-card hand at the beginning of your turn. You know what I mean? Just kind of silly. Next up, we have another tag team. We got Mewtwo and Mew Tag Team GX. Another very overpowered tag team Pokemon that saw a ton of play during its run. Of course, it did win the World Championships. It's got that ability, Perfection. This Pokemon can use attack of any GX or EX Pokemon on your bench or in your discard pile. You still needed the energy necessary to use the attacks, but this allowed you to make some cool toolbox decks. A popular way to play it was with Welder and Fire Pokemon like Reshiram and Charizard, and Macargo GX and stuff like that. And then you had other Psychic builds that played stuff like Trevenant Dusknoir, Gengar Mimikyu saw a lot of play with Mewtwo. Also, you just were able to copy any attack, and you just played a toolbox-style deck with Mewtwo. Rainbow Energy existed when this card was around. Aurora Energy then existed when this card was around. So you had ways to use that Rainbow Energy effect, and it by far and away was one of the best decks we had seen during the tag team era. And like I said, it didn't win the World Championships. I mean, probably cool. Like, I don't know. I don't recall Mewtwo ever being problematic like ADP was. Like, it was a pretty strong card. And because you were able to copy so many attacks, it did create some pretty devious combos. I think the worst we ever got to see out of Mewtwo was that it allowed you to copy, like, Gengar Mimikyu, and then you could go Trevnor. That was a toxic deck. But I don't know, like the Welder, Hyper, Firebox Mewtwo decks, I don't think they were ever bad for the game. Mewtwo's cool. I wouldn't say it was good for the game. Like, I'm sure the format would have been better off with a card not this powerful existing, but, it never really was, like, super bad in my opinion. It was bad for the game, though, or maybe was a little over the top. Of course, that is good old Mewtwo EX. Oh, man. The first ever big basic Pokemon. This card came out during 2011, and it completely changed the format and the game forever. Yes, this card was the first ever big basic that dominated the game. And when I said this card dominated the game, it dominated the game. This card dominated the game to unprecedented levels before Darkrai EX came out. X-Ball doing 20 damage, times amount of energy on both Pokemon was absurd. And back in the day, 170 HP Pokemon that did that on a basic was absurdly broken. Literally every deck were playing like 2 to 3 Mewtwo's, because at that point, you weren't even playing the Pokemon card game. You were literally just playing Mewtwo card game. You were just trying to see who could win first with Mewtwo. It was ridiculous. It by far ruled the game. For the time that it existed, it was very toxic, and I'm going to say it made the game worse. Part of the reason why I think it made the game worse is because it set the standard for card design going forward. Ever since Mewtwo EX came out, big basics just became super jacked up cards, and honestly, it is by far and away the most broken card design we've ever seen. Just big basic Pokemon are just really powerful cards, and it changes the power creep completely of the format and the game, and the game has never been the same since Mewtwo came out. I would argue it made the game worse because it invented the big basic archetype to the point where it became super power creep, right? And yeah, Mewtwo definitely made the game worse for sure. And I mean, it was not a very fun format when this card literally was in every deck and ruled the format with Mewtwo Wars. Next up is Oranguru, one of the most broken stall control cards we've ever seen in the history of the TCG. It's got that attack resource management. Put 3 cards from your discard pile onto the bottom of your deck in any order. Yes, this means you get infinite resources with Oranguru, and it did create some pretty insane control stall decks where you could infinitely get resources back. You never had to worry about decking out. You never had to worry about not running out of certain cards you want to use to control your opponent. This card in combination with cards like Chip Chip Ice Axe, Crushing Hammer, stuff like that, was a very devious duo. Oranguru, it did get banned, and honestly, looking back, I don't know how this card never ever got banned, to be honest, before. Like, it did get banned eventually, but I'm surprised it never got banned earlier. Definitely made the game worse. I mean, it's just a very strong attack that just probably shouldn't have existed ever. And in my opinion, it did make the game worse because it just was so good with control installed decks. And honestly, like looking back, dude, this card should have been banned a lot sooner for how broken its attack was. Next up is Pidgeot EX. Not the Pidgeot we're used to right now, but an old school Pidgeot, the first quick search ability. And basically, it is the same card as the Pidgeot we now have from Obsidian Flames. Once you're in turn, you can choose any one card from your deck and put in your hand. This card was very good back in the day. It's literally like a reprint or an old version of the Pidgeot EX we have now. And back in the day, it was really, really good. Now, I didn't want to include Pidgeot EX because it's too early to tell how much that Pidgeot will age. But this old Pidgeot we already know is very, very good and was one of the best cards from its era by far. Probably good for the game, right? Just a nice, strong search ability. I don't think back in the day people hated this card that much. It definitely was fine to have in the format. Next up is Reshiram and Charizard EX. Reshiram and Charizard Tag Team GX was one of the strongest GX cards, and actually, in my opinion, was one of the first big turbo decks from the Tag Team era. When this card came out, we also had the supporter card Welder, which allowed you to build this card up in the first turn of the game, actually allowing you to donk your opponent on the first turn. If you go first or go second, you can Welder immediately and then just immediately attack with Double Blaze GX, knocking out whatever's in the active spot. It just created a very hyper-aggressive deck. And then it was really obviously good with Mewtwo GX too. I would argue maybe this card stopped seeing play over time, but back in the day when it came out, it was really, really good. I'd probably just put it in that toxic category. Like, it was just kind of OP. Like, it just wasn't fun getting donked by this card. It just created, like, very hyper-aggressive playstyles. Maybe in the toxic category, you could maybe bump it down. Like, you could argue Welder was the reason why this card saw a lot of play. Yeah, okay, maybe it's better in the gatekeep category. Because, like, this card was enabled by Welder. We're not doing supporters in this video. We're only talking about the Pokemon. So, yeah, okay, maybe it wasn't as bad as people made it out to be, actually. But I would still put it in the gatekeeper category. Because during its era, it wasn't fun getting turn 1 donked by Reshizard. Just Welder allowed you to attack in the first turn of the game. It was kind of cheesy. Rapstrike Urshifu. I did want to have some VMAX representation. I think the highlight of the VMAXs was by far and away Rapstrike Urshifu VMAX. Has that Gale Thrust attack for 1 energy. When fighting, if this Pokemon moved from the bench to the active this turn, you could do 120 more damage. And then you had G-Max Rapid Flow, which you could play with Rapid Strike Energy. Urshifu saw quite a lot of success during its run. It won an IC. Did really good even up until rotation with the Rapid Strike Urshifu Inteleon deck. So definitely a very powerful VMAX. I would argue that besides Mew VMAX, it's one of the best VMAXs we'd ever seen. Honestly, it was cool. Urshifu used to exist before Manaphy came out. There was no bench barrier in the format. That was not fun. During the Evolving Skies format, before Brilliant Stars came out, there was no Manaphy, which made Urshifu a little cheesy, where, like, you basically kind of got punished for playing Evolving decks because you could just get Rapid Flowed. Yeah, it's a fine card, though. Like, it's a cool card. It's fine. Wasn't terrible to have in the format, in my opinion. Now, another broken card we got here. Another card that I think forced an early rotation, which was unheard of back in the day. And that is the Sableye here with the Overeager Pokebody. If Sableye is your active Pokemon at the beginning of the game, if you go first. So yeah, literally, if you just start with Sableye, you just, hey, I get to go first. You don't, I do. Yeah, it's kind of insane. And you get to donk your opponent because you can play very powerful cards to let you do more damage. And then, of course, you have Impersonate, search deck for supporter card, discard it. Then you had Overconfident. If the defending Pokemon has fewer remaining HP than Sableye, this attack does 40 damage. So if your opponent started with like a Pokemon with 60 HP, you'd play a Pokemon called Crobat, where you just play it down over and over again. You would damage that Pokemon, and then eventually they would have less HP than Sableye, and then you would just knock them out. It was kind of ridiculous. It created a donk format, and it was a very broken card to have in the game. There was a decent amount of draw back in the day that allowed you to see a decent amount of cards in your deck. Honestly, kind of one of the first patient zeros of like hyper-aggressive, big basic decks during its era. Yeah, probably did make the game worse. Or maybe, yeah, probably made the game worse. Like I said, it did force an early rotation, which was like unheard of and is a little cheesy. So yeah, it probably made the game worse for sure. Just another card that was just very silly. Look at that. 2 Sableyes and make it the game worse. Pokemon got to start putting bad Sableyes, bro. What the heck? That's crazy. Next up is Shaymin EX. Now, this is the godfather of big basic draw support abilities. Shaymin is now banned. It was because of expanded, but during its run in standard, it was never banned. It's got that setup ability. When you place Pokemon from your hand onto your bench, you can draw cards until you have 6 in your hand. So yeah, you could play as many Shaymin down as you want during a turn, which allowed you to see so many cards. This card existed during so many different eras of decks. Night March abused it. Seismitoad EX decks abused it, especially with Lysander's trump card. Mega Rayquaza abused it, just to name a few. So many decks took advantage of Shaymin EX. It is by far and away one of the strongest setup Pokemon we've ever seen in the history of the TCG. And I honestly think it maybe made the game worse because it made a lot of decks super fast, super aggressive. You could debate and argue that, yeah, Shaymin EX did make the game worse due to how fast it turned a lot of decks. Like, Night March was able to donk super quickly because they could see so many cards in a turn with Shaymin. Obviously, decks like Seismitoad got to abuse it. Shaymin was just a very strong ability, and it did feel like you had to play it in your deck at least to draw cards to be able to keep up with certain decks or being able to draw cards. Like, Shaymin was a liability to have in play, obviously, but I don't think that it was like that big of a deal to even have it on the bench sometimes. Like, it was ridiculous. Even just attack ended up being kind of useful. So, yeah, definitely Shaymin made the game worse to a degree. It definitely got banned because, there's so much draw in the format. Like, Shaymin, Dedenne, Crobat all existed, which let you see a little bit too many cards in a single turn. So they had to ban it. But during its run in Standard, you could argue that it did make the game worse. Maybe. Yeah, it's probably it's on the border between these two, in my opinion. But I think you definitely just the format, maybe looking back, if Shaymin didn't exist, the format would be a lot different and maybe a little bit more healthier. Next up is Slowking. I think this is a very infamous card. This is one of the first ever banned Pokemon cards we ever saw. Mainly because it was misprinted or something. I think it was like if your opponent played a certain card, they flipped a coin, it always got tails or something like that. I forget what it did exactly, but it got banned, or it didn't get banned for a while, but then eventually banned it because it was a misprinted card. Obviously, it's making the game worse for sure. I forget what it did exactly, but it had an ability where it made your opponent unable to do anything half the time, and it was just really silly. And back in the day, during that old school Pokemon era, it was a little cheesy. So yeah, definitely made the game worse for sure. We have Lost Origin Giratina. I wanted to highlight this card real quick here. This card, I don't know if it's one of the best cards ever, but it definitely has an ability that, kind of like Sableye, made a lot of one-price decks irrelevant because it had the ability to infinitely come back into play. That's what made the card good. Distortion Door. Once you're in turn, if this Pokemon is on your discard pile, you can put it on your bench. If you do, put 1 damage counter on 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So that ability is really good. Basically, you could use this card infinitely, and then, of course, you power it up with Malamar's ability to put Psychic Energy from your discard pile onto your Giratina. And that's how you would power up Shadow Impact, and then it did 130 damage, and you put 4 damage counters on one of your Pokemon. Just was a very strong card that a lot of one-price decks couldn't keep up with because this card always got back into play. It was a big basic. Like, back in the day, 130 HP was quite tanky for a basic Pokemon on a one-pricer. Probably just in the gatekeep category for sure. Just a very cheesy card that definitely kind of made the game slightly worse, but not too bad. It just kind of was not like Sableye where it completely gatekept one-price decks, but a lot of one-price decks couldn't keep up with the onslaught of Giratina being able to always come back into play in combination with Malamar. Then we have one of the most infamous EX Pokemon of all time, Seismitoad EX, baby. Seismitoad EX. An item lock attacker, Quaking Punch. For a double colorless energy, which is how this card saw play, did 30 damage, and your opponent could not play any items from his or her hand. Now, this card did exist at the time when Lysander's Trump card was in the format, and that card eventually did get banned, but yeah, Quaking Punch, just an absurd attack. Seismitoad, I think a lot of people look back on as one of the worst cards from the X and Y era, because item lock is no fun to play against, right? Definitely, honestly, kind of borders on making the game worse. Okay, I would probably just put in the toxic category. Toad was never that bad, and honestly, item lock was okay to have in a format where, people could dig through half their deck in one turn with Shaymin, and also had access to cards like Battle Compressor with Night March and stuff. So it kind of was a counterbalance to that type of aggressive playstyle. But it also wasn't very fun to be item locked constantly because it did exist during the time of Hypnotoxic Laser and Crushing Hammer. And like I said, Seismitoad with Lysander's Trump card also existed, which was a very powerful deck. And that's why Lysander's Trump card ended up getting banned pretty quickly. Toad definitely was toxic. I think it definitely borders on making the game worse. I don't think it completely made the game worse because it was a nice little counterbalance to have some of these more faster turbo decks. That's my opinion on Seismitoad. It was not fun, obviously, to be item locked, but I don't know, man. It wasn't completely game ruining, in my opinion. I'm sure people might have different opinions on that. We have a very strong Uxie card, another draw support Pokemon. It's very similar to Shaymin EX, actually, in a way. Once you're in turn, when you put Uxie from your hand on your bench, you can draw cards until you have 7 in your hand. So, another good way to just draw more cards. You could see a lot of cards. It saw play with an Uxie level X, which was nice, so it had a good level X to go on top of its setup ability. A very strong support Pokemon, much like Shaymin. But unlike Shaymin, it wasn't that bad to be able to use its ability to draw cards. Maybe it was bad with Sableye, as listed earlier, but it was never really that bad when it existed. So, yeah, it was cool. I don't know if I'd maybe put it good for the game, because you could argue maybe it wasn't good for the game to be able to have that much draw on a basic, but back then it wasn't as bad. So I would call Uxie Level X a cool card. It's in the cool category. Next up is Item Lock Vileplume. Now, in my opinion, the more infamous and strong Item Lock Vileplume card is the Harkle Silver one. There is another one from Ancient Origins, which also item locks your opponent. But this was a very strong card. Being able to item lock your opponent, it's very strong. Each player can play trainers from his or her hand. Item lock is OP, and these Vileplume cards have always had these strong item lock abilities. Probably toxic, but not game ruining. Like, it is toxic to item lock for the entirety of the game. Like, Seismitoad, it's hard to counter it sometimes if they just keep constantly quaking punching you. But there is definitely a point where maybe it got cheesy, like, especially when Force of Giant Plants existed. That's probably where I would classify the Vileplume cards, is when we got Force of Giant Plants, because you could literally item lock your opponent before they even had a turn, which was kind of silly. So that's maybe where I would classify this. That probably deserves to be in the toxic but not game ruining category, just because of Force of Giant Plants Vileplume was a very, very cheesy combo. Next up is Yveltal. Yveltal EX, one of the strongest early EX cards, which this card was very, very powerful back in the day. It was very similar to Mewtwo EX. It's a dark version of it that does more damage. For a Dark and a Colorless, you do 20 plus 20 more damage times the amount of energy on both active Pokemon. Yveltal existed in the format of that Darkrai EX we listed earlier. Dark Pat still existed. Yveltal saw a ton of play during its run, as highlighted as one of the strongest EX cards of its era. Probably borders on, it's probably cool. Like, it wasn't as bad as Mewtwo. It wasn't Yveltal Wars. It wasn't as bad as Mewtwo. There was a lot of dark support for Yveltal, but Yveltal was never really like a bad gatekeeper type deck when it existed. Like, there was cards like Raichu in the format that did help counter it. So Yveltal EX was never that problematic. It definitely was really strong, but never really was like over the top broken. All right, next up is Zacian V. Which I did want to highlight as one of the strongest V Pokemon. Yes, it did see a lot of play with ADP, and ADP was also a very good card, but Zacian definitely was also very good because it saw a lot of play outside of just being good with ADP. It's got that ability, Intrepid Sword. Look at the top 3 cards of your deck, and then put them in your hand, and then you can attach any number of basic metal energy you find there to this Pokemon, and then your turn ends. Kind of like Rotom V, where you just draw 3 cards, your turn ends. This actually would also allow you to attach energy cards to your own Zacian, which was pretty silly. And then it obviously had a very powerful attack, Brave Blade, which really was good because it KO'd a lot of other basic V Pokemon, which was extremely broken. So, yeah, Zacian definitely was a strong card. I never really was a big fan of this card. I thought it was a very silly design card. I would probably put it in the toxic category. It is weird to put Zacian V in there, but it by far and away is one of the best basic V Pokemon we'd ever seen. It did enable ADP for a bit. It was the best partner with ADP. I never was a fan of Zacian. I thought this card was just a very silly and poorly designed card, just because I thought the ability was really stupid. Being able to attach energy to yourself was kind of ridiculous. It had a lot of good combos, like with ADP and Lucario Melmetal tag team. Yeah, I never was a fan of Zacian V. I thought the card was kind of silly. I think a better version of Zacian V is Rotom V, where you don't really attack with it, you just use it for the ability, and you don't put energy in play, you just draw 3 cards. I think that's a more balanced version of ADP. And that's it. Like, yeah, I think it's a more balanced version of Rotom V. That's kind of where I stand on Zacian. I was never a big fan of Zacian V. In my opinion, I thought the card was not very fun to have in the game. It's a very stupid card. Yeah, I don't know. I never liked Zacian V that much. Then we have Charizard EX. I think this was like the only card I could think of from its like the era right now that deserved to be mentioned in this video from the Scarlet and Violet block was Charizard EX. Because you all know Charizard, it's a very good card. It's one of the best Pokemon EX cards we've ever seen. Quite literally. It's got that ability when you play from hand to evolve on your Pokemon, search your deck for 3 basic fires, attach your Pokemon any way you like. It's got a whopping 330 HP, and its attack, Burning Darkness, does more damage for each prize your opponent's taken. It's a very good card. We all know what Charizard does. I think it's definitely a gatekeeper for sure. I still am bordering on, like, okay, maybe Charizard's toxic. I don't think we've gotten to the point yet where Charizard's toxic. I don't think it's, like, over the top toxic. Maybe not, like, Zacian V toxic levels. Actually, I'll bump Zacian V down this tier too. Like, Charizard and Zacian are both cards that I do think are a little too over the top with how they were designed, but I don't think they're like flat out ruining the game or anything. I'm not a big fan of Charizard EX either. Like, I kind of like same opinion with Zacian V. I think that both Zacian and Charizard are just both very silly design cards that are a little too over the top. Like, Charizard can build itself up. It has an insanely powerful attack, and in my opinion, having a card like Charizard in the format prevents a lot of big basic EX decks from being playable. Like, as long as Charizard exists, a lot of big basic Pokemon won't ever be good because Charizard farms them. If they can't do 330 damage that easily, Charizard is just always going to beat them. And that's the issue I have with Charizard. It's a gatekeeper for sure. Yeah, definitely up there. Next up is Zoroark GX, one of the strongest cards of all time. In my opinion, one of the best cards of all time, period. It's got that ability trade. Once you're in turn, you can discard a card from your hand, draw 2 cards. Then you have its own attack. So not only was it a draw Pokemon, but it also was an attacker with Righteous Beating, doing 20 damage for each Pokemon in play. Keep in mind, back in the era when this card existed, 120 damage for a double Colorless Energy wasn't that bad because you can fill your entire board up and do 120. And then, of course, 210 HP made it bulky. And you saw Zoroark with a lot of different partners like Golisopod, Garbodor, Lycanroc, Buzzwole, Gardevoir, Alola Ninetales, Decidueye. Oh, so many partners for Zoroark. It was one of the most creatively designed cards ever due to the amount of partners it saw. It dominated the TCG for a long time. It did really well at Worlds and everything. Like, it's a very powerful card. And like I said, I think it's one of the best cards ever printed. Maybe even the best card ever printed just because of how well it was designed. I'm going to put it in the cool category. My issue with Zoroark is that it got a little bit cheesy when they could like spam Acerola. They got to see so many cards per turn, and it also attacked you, but it did have its counters, and it was a cool card. It's kind of like the Arceus V of its era, where it just saw a ton of play with all kinds of different attackers, and did create some interesting concepts. But yeah, I think it's a cool card for sure. I did want to highlight another old card here, Holland's Castform. Another old card that was very, very good back in the day. You can play it as an energy card from hand to one of your Pokemon that already has an energy card attached to it, and when you attach this card, return energy, attach that Pokemon into your hand. So it basically allowed you to provide a 2 energy cost when you attached it. It was like a free double rainbow energy. It was really, really good. You know what? I'm going to say it was good for the game. I didn't play back in the day. I'm not super familiar with Holland's Castform, but, you know, I think it was good for the game. I don't recall anyone ever saying this card was, like, super broken. Next up, we have 2 cards remaining. We have a Spiritomb card to talk about here. The Spiritomb was a very good setup card when it was around in the format. The Spiritomb card did have the Pokebody Keystone Seal when it was in the active spot. Each player couldn't play any trainers, so it was an item lock card, but back then, it wasn't that bad to item lock your opponent. It wasn't over-the-top like Seismitoad and Vileplume were. And then, of course, you had Darkness Grace. Search deck for a card that evolves one of your Pokemon and put it onto that Pokemon. And then, of course, you put 1 damage counter on your Spiritomb. So it allowed you to set up your deck and set up evolution Pokemon. And back then, the format was a little bit slower, and being able to also slow down your opponent with item lock made you able to set up your deck a lot quicker. So it was better for setup-based decks, right? And it's always nice to have a card like this in the format. You know what? It was good game design. It was a nice card to have in the format. It allowed you to set up your board a little bit, and it wasn't overbearing item lock. It wasn't cheesy item lock where it got to the point where it, like, ruined the game or anything. You know what I mean? And then finally, the last Pokemon on this list is, of course, the last Tag Team Pokemon I wanted to mention, Pikachu and Zekrom Tag Team GX. One of the strongest Tag Team GX cards we've ever seen. It's got the attack full blitz, search deck for 3 light energies, and attach them to one of your Pokemon, in any way you like. Very strong attack. And then, of course, you add, or to one of your Pokemon, not any of your Pokemon, just one. But still. And then had that Tag Bolt GX attack doing 200 damage. This Pokemon has at least 3 extra lightning energy on it. Did 170 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. A very strong stamp attack. Then when you got to pull that off, it was game-changing. Pikarom did see a ton of play during its heyday. It didn't really get power crept by the other strong tag teams like ADP or Reshizard or Mewtwo, but it saw a lot of play throughout its run. I think even up until it rotated, it saw a good amount of play. It saw a lot of play with Alola and Raichu Tag Team GX, which allowed you to paralyze your opponent. It was very good with Zapdos from Team Up. It was really good with Tapu Koko Prism and Thunder Mountain, which actually made it even easier to attack with Zekrom in a single turn. So Thunder Mountain and Tapu Koko made it very easy to, like, turn 1 attack with Pikachu and Zekrom. It didn't do an insane amount of damage, but it was able to self-accelerate to other Pokemon, which is pretty nuts. It was cool. I don't think there is ever a tag team that could ever be in the good for the game category. I'm going to be honest with you, because I think tag teams were always bad for the game. And I think at most tag teams can always be in the cool category, never in the good for the game. And Pikarom was probably the best designed, best overpowered tag team, if that makes any sense. Like, there's a lot of other tag teams that were, like, okay. They never were, like, as good as cards like Pikarom. Pikarom is definitely the best tag team that was the most balanced and healthiest for the format. It had a low amount of HP. It kind of got countered by other good fighting Pokemon. It never was, like, over-the-top cheese like ADP or Mewtwo and Mew or getting donked by Reshizard. So it definitely was a bit more of a balanced card, even though it did have a lot of cards at its disposal, like Electro Power, another card that let it do more damage, and then, of course, the Tapu Koko. But there you go, folks. That is my ranking of all of the best Pokemon cards ever printed and how healthy and good they were for the game. Let me know what you think of this tier list down in the description below, which I will also leave the tier list down in the description below if you want to go try it for yourself. Definitely recommend it, because it's a really cool thing if you're somebody who's played the game for a long time. Maybe this was a cool video for you, and hopefully it gave you guys some insight as to a history of the game if some of y'all are new to the game and don't know what some of these old cards do or how much of an impact they had on the game during their time. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe down below as always, and I'll catch you on another video here. Bye-bye.